sexy guys do. Explore what's soul in their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'll be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, lately we've had a series of episodes about things that are in almost daily view and yet which we very rarely think about in any systematic way. And this is one of those things, which is I had been reading headlines about our glorious leader, our dictatorship enthusiast in the White House, setting instructions to the Justice Department to pursue prosecutions against anyone who burns the American flag. And of course, we could do an episode on just the political repercussions of that, but that posed a more interesting question for me, which is there are a number of people in this country and perhaps internationally as well who think of flags as near sacred things, not quite something on the level of Jesus Christ and the Holy Ghost, but in the same sphere. It's a sacred thing for them. And yet I also know from my study of history that there were very large swaths of recorded history in which nobody was using flags at all. So the flag is kind of a derived object, as evolved over time. And I was curious about how we got from there to here, how we got from flags not being a thing at all to flags being something so sacred that you might end up in prison for burning it. So I asked you to look into that and get to the bottom of it, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you discovered.
Yeah, well, this is another interesting question, Mark. The percentage of interesting questions you ask me is very, very high. I hope I come close to matching that when I ask you questions. There's one big disclaimer, though, that I want to mention right at the beginning, and that is that your question mentions the role of flags in the whole of human history, but for the sake of time management, I'm going to confine my answer to U.S. history. Otherwise, this podcast would be 6 hours long, I suspect.
So we're not going to be talking about Babylonians, is what you're saying?
That's right. But it is important to me to tell you that the point you made in your question about flags at one time being not a thing is actually true of U.S. history. So my answer is going to track your general question, even though I'm going to confine myself to the United States. And thank you also for this opportunity to take our listeners on an excursion into the world of vexillology.
Wow, that's a new word. I've not heard that one before.
Nor had I. It's the study of flags. And this tour is going to include a brief detour into the dark cavern of vexillology, which is the worship of flags.
Oh, okay.
And I promise to get us there and back in under an hour. But first, given our subject matter today, I thought we should begin by honoring our flag by playing the most memorable rendition of the national anthem ever sung. And no, it's not Whitney Houston's version sung at the Super Bowl. The time is July 5th, 1990. The place is Jack Murphy Stadium in San Diego. The singer needs no introduction.
Yeah, Joe, I think I can say that my patriotism was reduced by about 47% in that version of the song.
Boy, you can be
Oh,
that
man.
precise about it, huh? 47%. Yeah.
Well, just the meter just kept dropping and dropping.
I
It
think
was
we
a
can agree, though,
big.
that the great artists have a way of making a song their own. Wouldn't you say?
I have heard that with great art, you find something new every time you come across it, and that was definitely a new version of the national anthem. I never heard those notes before.
Yes.
I never imagined that the song could encompass such a thing. So,
Yes.
yeah, my
Yes.
mind has been expanded.
And of course, for our listeners, that was the comedian and MAGA warrior Roseanne Barr with a rendition that seems oddly fitting given what's happening in our country today. For the many Americans who still think Barr was dishonoring the song and the flag, here's something to chew on. The Star Spangled Banner was originally written as a poem by Francis Scott Key after he watched British warships attack Fort McHenry in Baltimore during the War of 1812. In 1816, the poem was set to the tune of a well-loved British drinking song called To Anacreon in Heaven. So just think, Mark, how different our nation would be today if the tune they had chosen were 99 bottles of beer in the wall.
Yeah, it's an interesting sidelight to American history that so many of our iconic songs, including Yankee Doodle Dandy, were originally British drinking songs. We owe a great debt to blind drunk British gentlemen.
Yes, we sure do. And while we're on the subject of flag-related trivia, I want to add that the one thing most Americans think they know about our flag's provenance, that in 1776, George Washington asked a Philadelphia seamstress named Betsy Ross to create a flag for the new nation, is fake news. Most scholars now believe our flag was designed by a founding father who signed the Declaration of Independence, Francis Hopkinson of New Jersey, who also designed the Great Seal of the United States. The Second Continental Congress adopted the flag we know today as the Stars and Stripes on June 14, 1777. Before that, rebellious colonists used various flags, including one that still featured the British Union Jack. The 1777 resolution was vague about the design of the flag, saying not much other than that there be, quote, 13 stripes, alternate red and white, and that the Union be 13 stars, white in a blue field representing a new constellation, end quote. That led to many variations among the earliest national flags, including stars and stripes of different sizes arranged in staggered rows, concentric circles, and other configurations. Hopkinson's 1782 design for the Great Seal led to a deeper interpretation of the flag's red, white, and blue colors. Red apparently stood for hardiness and valor, white for purity and innocence, and blue for vigilance, perseverance, and justice. When Kentucky and Vermont became the 14th and 15th states in 1794, Congress resolved to create a new flag with 15 stars and 15 stripes. That's the flag that inspired Francis Scott Key. But as the country expanded westward in the early 19th century and more states entered the Union, it became impractical to add stripes, so the flag's design eventually reverted to 13 stripes to represent the original 13 colonies, with stars added for each new state. Between 1818 and 1912, our flag added 33 stars, with another 2 added in 1959 for Alaska and Hawaii. 2 more will hopefully be added for Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico as soon as the Democrats have the governing trifecta again. It's important to understand that in the late 18th century, when America was fighting its War of Independence, the idea of national flags was only just coming into existence. slowly evolving from military and maritime standards into symbols of national identity. Accordingly, the 1777 adoption of the Stars and Stripes was done with little fanfare, since the Founding Fathers, and early Americans generally, were not flag fetishists like many Americans are nowadays. Though they understood the benefit of having a unifying symbol, in the early days of our republic, the flag was treated more like a functional military tool than a sacred object.
Particularly in a period when many of even the people at the Constitutional Convention would have had a primary allegiance to their state rather than to the Union as a whole. So
Yes.
if there was a flag that they were going to salute, they might have saluted the flag of Massachusetts or Virginia rather than the Continental Congress.
Yes, quite right. The national flag was a way to distinguish American militias, ships at sea, and forts from those of the colonial oppressor, Great Britain. Battlefield flags told soldiers where they should move in the confusion of wartime smoke and noise. During the Revolution, saluting the flag would have been seen as an empty gesture, especially compared to joining the actual fighting to establish a new nation. The idea that a flag should be handled and treated with strict reverence simply didn't exist at that time. The founders' reverence was not focused on fabric. Their devotion was reserved for principles like liberty and justice and habits like self-governance. Indeed, you'd be hard-pressed to find a single depiction of the American flag in art produced during the Revolutionary War. As the geography professor Wilbur Zielinski pointed out in one article I read, we have an erroneous impression that the Stars and Stripes were ubiquitous in the Revolution, and that's because it's in so many paintings of the Revolution made a century after the fact, like Archibald Willard's The Spirit of 76, you know, the one with the two drummers and the fife player, which was painted in 1876.
Right. I'm also thinking of the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware,
Yes.
where there's a big flag flapping above them all.
Yes, that's right. I forgot the artist's name on that one, and that was painted before Spirit of 76, but still it was in the 19th century, long after the end of the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
Prior to the start of the Civil War, the American flag was rarely seen outside of ships, forts, and government buildings. Most Americans living in the first half of the 19th century would never have laid eyes on the Stars and Stripes, nor been able to identify it as their nation's flag. The cult of flag veneration that you identified in your question really didn't begin until April 1861. When the Southern states seceded from the Union, formed the Confederate States of America, and then attacked Fort Sumter. The flag that flew over Fort Sumter was taken by the departing commander of the fort and displayed to the public on a tour of the northern states. As Northerners learned of the attack, the flag's popularity exploded. Citizens declared their devotion to the Union by buying flags and placing them in front of their homes, on their mantles, and in their schools and churches. Historian Adam Goodhart wrote of that period, quote, "For the first time, American flags were mass-produced rather than individually stitched, and even so, the manufacturers could not keep up with demand. As the long winter of 1861 turned into spring, the abstraction of the Union cause was transfigured into a physical thing, strips of cloth that people would fight for and many thousands die for." End quote.
That makes so much sense in retrospect now that you've articulated it. Like, as we've already discussed, at the outset of the Union, your allegiance might have been more to your state than to the Union as a whole. But
Yes.
what better way to inspire allegiance to the Union than for that Union to be challenged fundamentally by a civil war? Suddenly, the U.S. as a whole, as a collective, became something that people were deeply invested in because it had been challenged by states attempting to secede from it. And so it makes total sense that would completely recast the role and the importance of the flag.
Yes, because the Civil War was really the time when the loose configuration of states needed to unite on both sides of the conflict. So, yeah, it isn't
Right.
surprising
Yeah.
in that context.
Right. And Abraham Lincoln, at the same time, was speaking so eloquently about the sacred nature of that union, the union as a thing that was established under God to be preserved as something which was important within the march of humanity as a whole. Symbolically, it was inevitable that it would take on so much more force.
Yes, right. I want to say something about flag bearing. That's the job of keeping the banner aloft in battle. Flag bearing came to be seen as a high honor during the Civil War, even though many who took the job became instant targets and died doing it. It was not unusual for multiple flag bearers to die in a single battle. According to Gerard C. Wertkin, the former director of the American Folk Art Museum in New York City, quote, "Reverence for the flag intensified into a civil religion with the sight of the stars and stripes accompanying men going off to war and draping the coffins of fallen soldiers. The Star-Spangled Banner resonated emotionally with citizens who displayed their loyalty and affection by integrating the flag motif into everyday life." End quote. The Union victory only solidified Old Glory's status as a national icon. It should come as no surprise, then, that using the flag to sell stuff also started around the time of the Civil War, with the stars and stripes slapped on everything from cigar fans to boxes of patented corn salve medicine to Native American braided moccasins and papoose carriers. After the war, communities across America hosted flag celebrations in mid-June to commemorate the 1777 Continental Congress resolution. At the Philadelphia World's Fair of 1876, celebrating the American Centennial, the flag was a ubiquitous patriotic symbol. Willard's Spirit of 76 painting was first exhibited there. So were new technologies of the time like photography and offset lithography, which led to an explosion of advertising, with product tins and labels, signs, and trading cards all sporting flag logos. Politicians started appropriating flag imagery for their campaign slogans. By the late 1890s, flag motifs could be found on clown costumes, pillowcases, pincushions, and pickled pork. Though I saw nothing in my research about the pecks of pickled peppers that Peter Piper picked.
And you have so much piqued my interest about those clown costumes. Was that Patriot the Clown? Like, what was the link to the Union Jack?
Yes. Probably not Bozo the Clown, right?
Yeah.
Although some people who dress themselves up garishly in the flag today, I might consider to be a modern incarnation of Bozo the Clown, but that's just me. Concurrent with the popularity of flag imagery on all manner of products in the late 19th century, flag use was also popularized by a new breed of American who had loftier goals in mind. Wertkin writes that, quote, "Veterans groups and women's hereditary societies embrace the flag as the vehicle for teaching young people proper moral codes, patriotism, and respect for cultural institutions." End quote. Citizens groups were formed, including the Grand Army of the Republic, which urged lawmakers to require that the flag be flown at all public schools and encouraged churches to do the same. In 1892, to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, a minister named Francis Bellamy published The Pledge of Allegiance in a popular children's magazine he edited called The Youth's Companion, and it was soon circulating widely on leaflets provided to schools across the country so that students could read it aloud. But here's something interesting, Mark. The pledge would quite likely have fallen into obscurity if not for the anxiety about immigration that many native-born Americans began to feel in the 1880s. To put that feeling in context, more than 2.7 million immigrants came to the U.S. in the 1870s, followed by over 5.2 million more in the 1880s, and a staggering 14.5 million in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Francis Bellamy and others believed that daily recitation of the pledge in public schools was central to ingraining loyalty to the United States in all those immigrant children.
Right, because the question was, would they be loyal primarily to their new home or to their old home? Like, would you have a population living domestically that was still primarily loyal to where they had come from, which
Yes.
Unfortunately is the attitude that raised its head once again later during World War II with the internment of Japanese Americans.
Yeah, right, I was thinking exactly the same thing as you were saying that. Reciting the Pledge of Allegiance became a daily ritual at schools long before Congress made it official in 1942 during World War II. I remember reciting the pledge when I was in elementary school in New Jersey in the 1970s, and I assume you did the same in Oregon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, with my hand across my heart, pledging allegiance to the flag of
Yeah.
the United States of America.
Yeah.
One nation under God, indivisible, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
can still do it to this day.
So you might be interested to know, Mark, my now 23-year-old son told me that the pledge was recited in New York City classrooms when he was a kid. I didn't know that till I asked him. I checked to see if that's still the case today. Students are required by law to be offered the opportunity to say the Pledge of Allegiance each day. But as per the New York City Department of Education's Student Bill of Rights, they can't be compelled to participate. So I guess that's progress.
Yeah. Just hand everything off to peer pressure, because how could that go wrong?
Right. Lest you think that objecting to the over-commercialization of the American flag is just a recent phenomenon. That too started in the late 19th century, with patriotic societies charging that blatant commercial exploitation of the flag cheapened its symbolic resonance and was tantamount to flag desecration. To quash it, more than 200 national, state, and local committees were formed to establish the proper usage of the flag by merchants, politicians, and advertisers. Eventually, Congress codified flag design standards and flag etiquette in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Even with those restrictions, flag use only grew. Living flags were a thing in the early 20th century. In my research for this episode, I saw a photo taken in 1917 at the U.S. Naval Training Station in Great Lakes, Illinois, of 10,000 Navy cadets forming a gigantic flag. One wonders whether those congressional design standards were ever really enforced. The graphic designer and author Kit Hinrichs, who amassed a collection of more than 5,000 flag-related items, told Collectors Weekly, quote, "I have found flags frozen in ice cream, made of broken tile and cemented in a wall, carved in tree trunks, baked in cookies, molded in jello, etched in granite, made of pressed flowers, and sprinkled with red, silver, and blue glitter," end quote. Online, you can find Stars and Stripes bikinis, tank tops, bodysuits, G-strings, and butt plugs. Not that I actually searched for those items, Mark.
For your Google search history, I certainly hope not.
A friend told me.
Yeah.
Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us. Because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. And did you know that you can now listen to full episodes of Mansplaining on YouTube and check out our podcast music on Spotify? Yep, it's true. Just type Mansplaining Podcast into the search bar on either platform and you'll find us. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really. Due to the U.S.'s emergence as a superpower in the 20th century, the American flag is today one of the most widely recognized symbols in the world, representing not only our country, but its people. It wasn't until well over a century after the Second Continental Congress that Flag Day, June 14th, was formally established as a national holiday, with a proclamation by President Woodrow Wilson in 1916, and then a law signed by Harry Truman in 1949. In 1942, a formal U.S. flag code prescribing how the flag should be handled, displayed, and/or disposed of was approved by Congress, though it didn't become part of federal law until 1976. The first federal laws prohibiting flag desecration didn't come until the 1960s.
I was looking at the flag code earlier today as I was prepping for us to record this episode, and there are so many elements there. For instance, the prohibition about allowing the flag to touch the ground and how people should salute it, depending on, like, military people do this and civilians do that.
Right.
It struck me reading through that as someone who's studied religion formally that that's a highly ritualized code, and that in a way answers my question. That how did the flag become sacred? Well, you make something sacred by instituting rituals around it, rituals that need to be followed. The ritual, in effect, creates the feeling that this is something separate from this mundane world that we live in.
Yes.
And so, in effect, that's what makes the flag sacred, is treating it as sacred through ritualized behaviors.
Yes, agreed. And most of us don't know all the ritualized behaviors that are embedded in the flag code. And people who use the flag routinely violate those rules. Like, you're not supposed to have a flag on a T-shirt, for example. And the thing you mentioned about not ever letting it hit the ground. I think the only time we Americans really see the flag handled properly is at those formal events when, the prisoners of war come home or the dead are buried, and you see the soldiers folding up the flag in the ritualized way. I mean, the rules are much more detailed than any of us really knows.
Right. Yeah, the very solemn and, again, rule-defined process of folding it in this series of, like, triangle, and then handed to the widow or the widower, and then the 21-gun salute, and the whole thing around it gives this sense that this is, in essence, a religious object.
Yes.
But what you mentioned about it, you're not supposed to have it on T-shirts. I've seen men wearing diapers of the American flag. And
Right.
that, for me, that recalls the episode that we did on dress, like standards of dress, and how the rules of dress create a structure for violating those rules as a form of protest.
Right.
That once you set up these rules of this is how you handle the flag, you create a code for people who want to strategically violate that code as a way of sending a counter message. And so within the structure of these rules, you have this back and forth dialogue, each referencing the same set of rules without explicitly referencing them, which I think is super interesting.
Yes, that is interesting. And I would say the institutionalized reverence cries out for the irreverent to step forward, you know? And the timing of your remark is perfect because I'm just about to pivot to that very thing. So I mentioned federal laws prohibiting flag desecration coming into effect in the 1960s. To that point, you can't truly understand our fractured national conversation about the flag without delving into Supreme Court cases about saluting and desecrating. So that's what I want to talk about now. As I mentioned earlier, we falsely think of Betsy Ross as an American flag heroine. But here are a few Americans you probably never heard of who truly did play outsized roles in our flag's history. In 1935, 11-year-old Lillian and 10-year-old William Gobaitis were expelled from their school in Minersville, Pennsylvania, because they refused to abide by the school's daily exercise of saluting the flag. The Gobaitis children were Jehovah's Witnesses and believed that saluting the flag was forbidden by the Bible. At the time, most public school students were forced to salute and pledge allegiance to the flag every day, like you and I did a few decades later. Their refusal to do so touched off a constitutional battle between freedom of speech and the state's authority to compel respect for national symbols. Initially, the Gobaitises were victorious in the lower courts, but that was reversed by a 1940 Supreme Court ruling, 8-1, that the government did possess the authority to compel such behavior for the sake of, quote-unquote, national cohesion. Now, just 3 years later, with the lone dissenter in the 1940 case now serving as the Chief Justice, the court overruled itself in a separate case with similar facts, again, Jehovah's Witnesses, finding by a vote of 6-3 that the First Amendment doesn't compel unanimity of opinion on any topic, that symbols like the flag shouldn't receive a level of deference that exceeds constitutional free speech protections, and that curbing dissent was an ineffective way of generating national unity. Justice Robert Jackson's majority opinion included these stirring words, and I quote, "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein." End quote. That sounds about right to me. Flag burning is another polarizing issue that found its way to America's courtrooms. Outside the Republican National Convention in Dallas in the summer of 1984, a homegrown communist named Gregory Lee Johnson burned an American flag to protest the policies of then-President Ronald Reagan. He was arrested under a Texas law barring the desecration of venerated objects, then was tried, convicted, and sentenced to a year in jail. In the resulting Supreme Court case in 1989, the court ruled 5-4 that states cannot enact blanket bans on flag desecration because, at least under some circumstances, flag burning was expressive conduct of a political nature and therefore protected under the First Amendment. William J. Brennan's majority opinion held that, quote, "If there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable." End quote. The Reagan-Bush-era Congress responded to the Johnson decision by passing the Flag Protection Act of 1989, a law criminalizing flag burning, mutilation, and defacement. The Supreme Court took up a challenge to that law just 11 months after the Johnson decision. In the second case, the same 5-justice majority from Johnson reaffirmed that flag burning could be protected speech and that prosecuting people protesting the Flag Protection Act by setting fire to American flags violated the First Amendment, with Justice Brennan writing, quote, "The act still suffers from the same fundamental flaw. It suppresses expression out of concern for its likely communicative impact," end quote. In other words, you can't ban flag burning just because it offends your sensibilities. And there's a bright line distinction between truly disturbing the peace and merely causing offense.
So what occurs to me as you go through that is that on the one hand, it's easy to think, well, a nation that can be challenged by some person burning a flag suggests that that nation is a fragile thing. Like America should be able to stand up to the challenge of someone wearing the flag as a pair of underpants, you know?
Right.
But the flip side of that is if you look at it through a sacred lens, then if the flag is sacred, then desecrating the flag is essentially a sin. It's an act against this God which you have created, the God of the flag, the God of the idea of the nation. And so through that lens, it becomes more not defensible, but understandable, the perspective on it, that it is an innately wrong act once you start to think of the flag as itself a sacred object, to desecrate that object. And
Yes.
so through that lens, I still disagree with the perspective, but it becomes a bit more understandable than the notion that, oh my God, you can't burn a flag because that's dangerous somehow. I don't see the danger, but I do see how someone would see it as innately wrong, as essentially sinful.
Yeah, and as you say that, it occurs to me, I think if you made a Venn diagram of flag worship, the circle of people who are very religious probably maps onto the circle of people who are flag absolutists too. I venture to guess that, and kind of supports the point you just made.
Yeah, it's safe to say that those same people believe that God and America are overlapping Venn diagrams. Going back to the manifest destiny idea, that America is a country that is aligned with God's intent for the world, and that we are here as a Christian nation in order to enact God's will within the world. So the two dovetail very nicely.
Yes. And those people we just described clearly do not agree with the Supreme Court precedents I just laid out. And that leads to my next point, which is despite those precedents, which have stood for more than 80 years and 35 years, respectively, the reactionaries in the MAGA movement are predictably trying their darndest to turn back the clock. House Republicans introduced a bill this past February called the Promoting American Patriotism in Our Schools Act that requires local educational agencies to enforce policies requiring public schools to, quote, display the U.S. flag, educate students about the U.S. flag, and direct students and staff to recite the Pledge of Allegiance on a daily basis, end quote. Since 1989, Congress has made repeated attempts to add an anti-flag burning amendment to the Constitution, but none received the required support of 2/3 of the Senate. And as you referenced in your question, just last month, President Trump issued an executive order entitled Prosecuting Burning of the American Flag that cites the Johnson case to argue that notwithstanding its prior rulings on First Amendment protections, the Supreme Court did not intend to condone activities like flag desecration, quote, conducted in a manner that is likely to incite imminent lawless action, end quote, which was one of the exceptions mentioned in the Texas v. Johnson case. It instructs the Attorney General to consider litigation to, quote, clarify the scope of the First Amendment exceptions in this area, end quote. Most legal experts think Trump's executive order has about as much chance of overturning Johnson as the Seattle Mariners have of winning the World Series. But with this Supreme Court and its supermajority of fellow reactionaries, who the hell knows?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, if I were a betting man, I would bet that the court would line up directly with the White House on this and say, let's forget all that precedent. It is a mortal sin to burn the flag and therefore entirely proper to send such people to prison. That would be what I would anticipate coming out of this.
Yeah. But it again would go against decades of precedent, and this Supreme Court seems not to respect precedent, so you could be right. All right, I want to conclude by addressing the last part of your question as you put it to me at the end of our last episode. And that was, what does all the history we just recounted have to teach us about flag-related controversies today? I think it teaches us two things. Number one, a disturbingly large segment of the U.S. population places a ton of symbolic, patriotic, and emotional value on inanimate objects like flags. And number two, all that misplaced emphasis on inanimate objects blinds us to what truly matters. To illustrate what I mean by that, I want to tell you about what might be my favorite political cartoon I've ever seen. It was drawn in the late 1990s by Steve Kelly, then of the San Diego Union Tribune. For many years, I had it pinned to the corkboard above my desk in my office. It so perfectly captures my feelings about the idiocy of venerating inanimate objects that I still have it all these years later. I'm going to scan my browned copy of the cartoon and post it to our Facebook page so everyone can enjoy it. But let me try to describe it now. It depicts a middle-aged white guy in a suit ID'd as House, referring to the Newt Gingrich-led Republican House majority of that time that, among other things, published the infamous Contract with America and also impeached Bill Clinton. This generic, balding Republican congressman is standing in front of a blackboard just inside an elementary school classroom that has a U.S. flag mounted on the wall. And he's pointing down sternly and speaking at a boy with a blank stare, aged maybe 10 to 12 years old, who's wearing a backpack and carrying a rifle in his hands with his finger on the trigger. The congressman's speech bubble reads as follows. "Don't let me catch you pointing that thing at any flags, mister." For me, at least, that says it all.
Yeah. Thoughts and prayers for flag burning. Thoughts and prayers should turn this around, and we don't need actual legislation because we've already established, haven't we, that we don't need legislation for gun control or anything like that.
Right. And meanwhile, it's fine to carry the loaded rifle with your finger on the trigger in class. Just don't point it at any flags.
I think probably my biggest thought coming out of this is that sacred is something that happens rather than something that's planned. That things acquire sacrality through processes that were not anticipated and maybe not intended. And that the Civil War, which was about some pretty baseline things, created this notion of a flag as a side effect. And now more than 100 years later, that side effect is still having tremendous impact on this country long after we're divorced from the original reasons for it. This fission within the country between two factions that fought against each other under different banners. In a strange way, we're still fighting that battle, but the roles have switched because the greatest reverence for the country, for the flag these days, would be within those same southern regions that originally intended to secede from the Union that was represented by that flag. Yeah. And so it's a curious flip-flop and a lesson in history's unintended consequences.
Yeah, that's really thought-provoking, Mark. And I wonder, is the sacrality inevitable? Like, let's do a little thought experiment. What if the United States had not had a civil war? We know that the United States was initially configured as this loose confederation of states with Articles of Confederation, and the founders had the foresight to know that that just wasn't going to work, to have it too loosely put together, right? So they came up with this constitution that we have now. And yet the state's pretty much active for the first nearly a century as their own independent actors, you know? They were until the Civil War. What if we had avoided the Civil War and come up with some kind of awful compromise on slave states and free states and gone on our merry way to today? Would the flag have ever become a sacred object? You know, would that sacrality have come to pass? I wonder.
Right. The hypothetical that you imagined very nearly happened. I happen to be reading right now Team of Rivals, which is a history of how Lincoln became president and then put together a cabinet of the men that he had fought for that nomination.
Yes.
And for a long time, Lincoln's cherished hope was that you could just contain slavery within the regions it was already in, and it would die out through natural causes, essentially. And so you wouldn't need to have legislation to outlaw slavery. It would just go away on its own. And so that's what Lincoln himself hoped to be the outcome of the struggle among the states. It didn't happen for various reasons, but I think probably if that wish had been fulfilled and that they just kind of made their peace with each other and let slavery play itself out, I think that the first crisis there would have been something like World War I or World War II, where it would have been the first time that the U.S. fought in an overseas war. And then once again, you're not fighting as a Virginian or as someone from New York or from the state of Washington. You're fighting as an American. You're representing your country. You're fighting for something that you think your country represents. And I wonder if that would have just been a delayed creation of this
delayed by
national
50
sense
years.
of the flag has represented that.
Yeah.
It poses the question of whether the process is inevitable or if it's very contingent on specific events. And I feel like it's probably more on the scale towards inevitable than contingent. But
yes, and I think so too. And here's another reason that's prompted by what you just said. Lincoln's priority was preserving the Union, right? So he was willing to tolerate some awful things, including continuation of slavery for some period of time to preserve the Union. But the preservation of the Union became the sacred object. So even though in our hypothetical we didn't fight a civil war, the Union would have still been this revered national object whose symbol was the Stars and Stripes. So therefore, would it be inevitable that there'd be a cult around that?
Right. Yeah, and Lincoln was not the only one to sort of mythologize the Union. There were many politicians at the time who were giving speeches saying, in effect, stop talking about slavery because it's going to tear apart the Union. We need to keep the Union together. So there was a broad consensus within the country that the Union was to be preserved, that the legacy of the Founding Fathers was not to be discarded so easily. And so, yes, it does suggest that the idea of the Union and the flag as representing it would have acquired that importance, whether or not Gettysburg had ever happened.
Right. Yeah, agreed. And thanks again for an interesting question. This was a fun one to research.
Yeah. I enjoyed your presentation and our conversation on it, so thank you for that. And I'm sure you have a question for me.
I do. And I want to say about this one, in furtherance of my recent search for unusual topics for us to discuss, like gerontocracy, expiration dates, not typical mansplaining fare, I have what I think is a fun question for our next episode of Mansplaining. Immigration has arguably been the number one political issue in the United States in the age of Trump. So let's talk about two notable immigrants, potatoes and tomatoes. Potatoes are a staple of the Irish diet. And when you think of Italian food, you think of tomatoes. But potatoes are not native to Ireland, nor are tomatoes native to Italy. Both originated in the Americas. So here's my question, Mark. How did these two illegal aliens, potatoes and tomatoes, migrate from the New World to the Old World and take over Irish and Italian cuisine?
Okay. Well, the short answer is because they're delicious, but I'll try to get into it a little bit more deeply than that. I love the question. I love different ways of looking at history.
Yes.
And so looking at it through potatoes and tomatoes, I'm sure will be a lot of fun.
Yes, I agree. And it's about time we did a foodie episode, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Yeah, it's past time, I'd say. Mm-hmm. So I will be spending the next couple of weeks delving into foodstuffs. In the meantime, our listeners can perhaps check out the flag and consider their own embedded assumptions about the flag and what it represents. We will circle back with something delicious in a few weeks' time. But until then, that was Joe, and this is Mark, and we'll see you next time.
Talk to you next time.
Some folks are in the feed, some prefer the crotch. Some folks like to role play, some just like to watch. But my special fancy can often be a drag, 'cause it gets a little antsy, oh, when you're wrapped up in the flag. I got a flag fetish, baby. Give me my stripes and my star. Flag fetish, mama. I might belong behind bars. You can be kinky, do nasty things with that slinky. You could prefer electrostimulation or autoerotic asphyxiation. But I got y'all beat when it comes to obsession. I can't take the heat, boy, so I make my confession. I got a flag fetish, baby. Give me my stripes and my star. Flag fetish, mama. You could put me behind bars. When I force you to wear my flag, it's not dressy, more like wet and messy. Not exactly menstrual, but occasionally non-consensual. If you don't like this sport, take it to the Supreme Court. I got a flag fetish, baby. Give me my stripes and my stars. Flag fetish, mama. Better put me behind bars. I got a flag fetish, baby. You know what I need? Just 13 stripes. Flag fetish, mama. And a whole mess of stars.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.
Best